Welcome back, everybody, to the Starlit Stories podcast. In this one, me and my friend Victoria are interviewing Mhara Starling. We recorded this quite some time ago, but it is still super relevant, and I cannot wait for you guys to listen to it because Mhara is a very well-known Welsh witch because she is one of the only ones truly dedicated and devoted to learning about the history of magic in Wales. We talk about this in the podcast, but this is super exciting because Mhara talks about an otherworldly experience she's had. She talks about meeting the Fae world, meeting the otherworld, Annwfn, which is the otherworld of Wales, and I cannot wait to dive into this with you. The quality isn't as good as my previous podcasts, and it will get better over time. So if you would like to support me and support my content, please head over to my Patreon. There are some different memberships there, as well as an option to just support, and we can get some better equipment. Blessings, everybody. Let's dive right in. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Polarity Podcast. We're excited to bring on yet another witch, and it's really interesting because out of all of the interviewees we've had, all but one have been witches.
Yeah, we didn't even realise until like 20 minutes ago. I think we might have a thing.
Yeah. But yeah, so Mhara is from the same country that we're from in Wales. We're from down south. Mhara's from up north, and she lives on a beautiful island called Anglesey, which is a mystically magical place that I haven't had the pleasure to visit yet. But if you don't know who Mhara is already, she is an author, of course, a witch, and at the forefront of bringing some lost knowledge and lost stories to the world of witchcraft and paganism through a very very literate and scholarly in a very scholarly manner, I'd say. I've learned a lot from you in a very easy to digest way, and yeah, thank you so much for being here.
And thank you for the Welsh in it as well. Like, I've looked into so many Celtic things, and so often there's seems to be a lot of Irish stuff about and not as much Welsh. So like really grateful for that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for having me on. And yes, the same reason that I really started doing the things that I do, because every time I looked up anything to do with Celtic kind of magic, it was always Ireland that would pop up. So yeah, I was very fortunate to have a lot of amazing people around me who are very much embedded in a more Welsh stream when it came to the continuum that they fell into when it came to witchcraft and magic. And so at the end of the day, I kind of decided, well, there's no kind of book out there or YouTube channel that focuses on Welsh paganism from that specific expression. And after talking to a few friends, so many of them went, well, why don't you do it then? And I went, oh, I guess I should. And years later, I finally did it. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
Would you say you consider your practice largely pagan based then? Or do you take some things from other places? Or I'm just going to get straight into the juicy stuff, if that's okay.
No, absolutely. I definitely see myself first and foremost as a Welsh pagan. So I'm very much rooted in the land that I'm currently walking upon. And I've been that way now for very many years. I remember when I first got into paganism and witchcraft, I started as a lot of people do. I had a very broad interest in mythology and magic in general. And I had a lot of friends who were quite obsessed with Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology. And though I was into like folklore, mostly fairy folklore and things like this, I never really particularly took on to like the Greek and the Egyptian stuff beyond, very basic kind of reading. I never really got obsessed with it in the same way a lot of my friends did. So when I first came into witchcraft, I tried to fit into that mold. I remember, gosh, a bit of an embarrassing story, I suppose. I remember I went into a pagan shop, like a little metaphysical shop that was local to me, and I bought a pentagram necklace that was held up. The pentagram itself was held up by the goddess Isis, an Egyptian goddess. And I remember buying that, even though I had no idea who Isis was and I had no connection to her at all. But I just felt like as a teenager, as like a 13-year-old person who was obsessed with witchcraft, I was like, that's what witches do, isn't it? We buy crystals and we buy herbs and we like gods and goddesses from across the world. And it was Christopher Hughes, who runs the Anglesey Druid Order. He lived down the road from me. And so we eventually got in connection with each other because he was BFFs with my mentor, Julie. Julie was an insane and intense woman. I loved her so much. She died about a year and a half ago now, but she was my mentor. She dragged me into the world of witchcraft and magic, kicking and screaming. And she was this larger than life woman who took me out to burial chambers and sacred sites across Anglesey, and she would dance about and enter into these trance-like states, and it was a sight to behold because she'd be there wafting about her pendulous breasts and dancing as if she was taken over by some spirit. And I loved her so much. And she was BFFs, as I said, with Christopher. So Christopher and me ended up meeting through her. And then I remember vividly, I have this really vivid memory of sitting in Christopher's office as a teenager, absolutely scared out of my mind because I was intimidated by this force. You know, he's quite a character himself, this force of nature. And I remember I said something about my necklace. I said, oh, yeah, the goddess Isis is on there and I need to look into the goddess Isis more. And I remember he turned to me and he said, I find it sad that so many pagans have such an obsession with gods and goddesses, but they don't look at what's here on our front door. They don't look at what's right here in front of them. They instead want to look across the sea to some far off country when we have so much going on right here on our doorstep that's being ignored. And that spoke to me on like a very visceral and deep level when he said it. To some people, when I say that story, I think some people might think of it as judgmental or rude. But to me, it hit a chord because it made me go, you know what? You're right. There is so much here that is being overlooked and ignored. So from that moment at like 14, 15, however old I was, I made the decision. I was like, this is going to be my life. So I describe myself as a Celtic polytheist and animist, which means I believe in numerous gods, and I believe that the world itself is inherently inspirited. Everything around us has a spirit of its own. And I'm also a Swinwraig, which is the Welsh way of saying I practice folk magic, and I practice a stream of folk magic, which is specifically Welsh. So yeah, that's pretty much my path. I'm a pagan, polytheist, animist, and folk witch, if I have to use the English terms.
Yeah. I actually, that's a lot. That reminds me of, so I've been listening to your book on Audible, and one of the things, like straight away, you triggered me absolutely straight away. Not in a mean way, but not that long ago on the podcast, we were talking about my aversion to being labeled with anything. Like anyone around me would probably say, "Oh yeah, she's a witch," you know. In fact, as a child, and I think, and I've had to process it because in your book you mentioned about how some labels can actually help people to feel like they're not alone and things like that. And it got me thinking, like, where was this aversion to labels coming from? And yeah, it got me. And then all these things came back from my childhood. And like, I grew up in the valleys and I was a little bit different. And like, I wore all black. And then, so being labeled a goth and being labeled a witch was a very negative thing. And it was like something that the other kids would make a point of like doing to me as opposed to allowing me to embrace. So thank you for that. I've actually done a little bit of process in there. Um, yeah, I've found the book really interesting. It's and I love the stories as well. Stella and I were talking earlier about the minor discrepancies between like the stories. They're the same stories, but like in your book, you mentioned about Vortigern and how he'd wake up in the morning and his new city would be all disheveled and broken. And the story that I heard was that it was sinking. And he ended up building it like in another field because the boy prophet explained to him about the two dragons fighting underneath. But it's like the little discrepancies. And I think like sometimes it's based on where you live in the country as well. And I feel like we do get a bit of a watered down version sometimes in the South. Um, I was lucky I did go to a Welsh speaking school, but even there, like, I don't know. I just feel like it's just a bit watered down, you know.
Yeah, well, for me, it there wasn't even no water there to be there was nothing there to be watered down with. So I'm from Cardiff. We're not far, we're only about half an hour's distance, but Cardiff is very much a London, and only really if you get your magnifying glass out can you tell that you're in Wales. And my whole life I've not felt Welsh really, and in school the Welsh language was very much an uncool thing to learn about. And when I had my spiritual awakening and I went online to look at, how can I process this? How can I integrate this? Nothing pagan at all came up at all. I went into Buddhism, I went into Hinduism, and very thankful because of my mindfulness practices have been very good for my mental health. But it took years for me to look at, as you said, look outside of my door, at my front doorstep, and everything that is here. And it's wild how different the stories are. Like, you were taught stories, you grew up around the folklore. I was never in school. I don't remember one Welsh story being told to us, but I do remember that on the Eisteddfod we had something that no one else I know had, which was everyone the lights would go off, and 8 students would wear white gowns on either side of the assembly audience, and with candles, and go up and present to the winner, the poet, the bard. But that was about it. Everything else was Christian based. So yeah, even though we're all from the same country, and back in the Celtic days, everyone would have been brought up around stories that are expressions of the natural world, using the natural world as a way to connect us to ourselves.
That's a good point about the Christian thing, though. Do you find there's any because obviously to be pagan at a certain point, even in Wales, it was quite Christianized, so they sort of melded together a little bit. Would you say there's any sort of pagan Christian elements in your practices, or are you quite I don't know, down them? You know what I mean? Like, are there any of those things like that creep in, or that you enjoy even?
Oh, definitely. It's difficult, I think, in Wales specifically, or any of the Celtic nations, really. When we look at it, it's really difficult to completely ignore the Christian culture that is permeated throughout our heritage and such. It's very difficult to fully create a practice that is wholly pagan and not somehow influenced by the Christianity, because to start with, Christianity has been here a long, long time. It's been here for absolute centuries now. It's something that has been part of Welsh culture for so, so long. And then the other thing is that everything we know that we draw inspiration from within a modern kind of Welsh pagan sense, whether we're looking at the Mabinogi or whether we're looking at, various old pieces of Welsh lore and such, it all comes from a period in time that was already Christianized. So we don't have any records of how the Mabinogi would have been in a pre-Christian context, if it existed at all in a pre-Christian context, because before Christianity came into this country, we didn't write anything down. We were a purely oral tradition. We taught everything via word of mouth. We've always valued the spoken word and the power of words itself. So nothing was ever recorded, really. Even the things that our ancestors have left behind, a lot of it is pre-Celtic even. So when we look at things like yesterday, I'm just thinking, because currently it's the day after the summer solstice, and even yesterday when I was at Bryn Cellydd, we see these places as inherently tied to our culture. Bryn Cellydd is this glorious henge and burial chamber that's up on Anglesey in North Wales. And we think of it as inherently Celtic because it's here, it's within our landscape, and it's part of our culture now. But Bryn Celli, as well as all the other kind of ancient monuments that we have around Wales, they predate the Celts even. They're older than that. So they're not even part of Celtic culture, really. Maybe they adapted them into Celtic culture, but we don't know that for certain. Nothing that the ancient pre-Christian Celts of this area, this location, ever did was recorded or written down. The only echoes we have comes from what other cultures wrote about us. So we have like the Romans who wrote certain things about us, that they talked about what kind of people we were. And I personally, I don't like to look at those instances of what they've written about the Celts that lived in these lands as pure evidence of what they actually did, because we have to remember that they didn't like each other a lot of the time. A lot of the time, the Romans wanted to cast the Celts in this bad light because they were pushing their empire, and they were pushing the idea that the Roman Empire was something better and more civilized than Celtic culture. So they were trying to bring them down, essentially. And we kind of see that because the way they talk about Celtic culture as if it's full of human sacrifice and nasty, horrible curses constantly. Everyone's always doing nasty things, and we're bathing in mud because we don't know how to bathe ourselves and such.
Real propaganda. It's all propaganda.
Absolutely. And so to me, it's like we didn't start getting any actual native voices writing down what they were doing and thinking and believing until, unfortunately, this country was already heavily Christianized. So when we look at things like the Mabinogi, which is our primary collection of myths and legends, or we look at any of our ancient literature and such, it's all from around the 9th to the 12th century. And we know that Christianity was already very much established here by that point. Everyone was pretty much a Christian by that point. And there are a lot of academics who say, there's nothing pagan about these stories at all, that they don't believe that there's any kind of inkling at all. But then there's other academics who say, no, there is a little bit, there's like a hint, something hidden within these stories that have obviously made their way from some pre-Christian Celtic past and is being echoed within these stories that are being told now. So the best example of that is like the gods and goddesses that we talk about. So people like Rhiannon and Arianrhod and Ceridwen, there is no evidence at all within an archaeological context, within a historical context, that Arianrhod or Rhiannon were actually goddesses before the modern day, as in now when witches are worshipping them. It's very obvious they're goddesses now because there are numerous witches across the world, from Cumbraen down the road or all the way in bloody Toronto, Canada. You have people building altars to Rhiannon and Arianrhod, so they're goddesses now. But the debate about whether or not they were ever goddesses in the past is a bit of a long-winded debate, because there were no shrines to them. We don't have any evidence of shrines to Rhiannon or Ceridwen or Arianrhod. We can guess that maybe they're similar to certain goddesses that existed in Gaul and in other parts of the world that were Celtic, because we can find similarities. So you often find people talking about certain goddesses, like pagan goddesses like Epona, who was a goddess associated with horses, and going, well, she must be similar to Rhiannon then. But again, that's all theory and guesswork, and it's very much just all based on, well, Rhiannon rides a horse and Epona rides a horse, so they must be the same thing, right? So it's a bit tenuous, and a lot of scholars don't think that's enough to go off of. So then the only time we ever see Rhiannon and Arianrhod and Ceridwen come up is in these later Christian tales. And so to some, it's like, no, they're purely Christian characters. But then there's the argument of, well, maybe Rhiannon wasn't a goddess in the ancient pre-Christian Celtic past, but maybe Rhiannon is just the Christian equivalent of a goddess that did exist before. So maybe she wasn't called Rhiannon once upon a time. Maybe she had a different name and she was understood very differently, but she survived into Christian culture as Rhiannon. And so we have an echo or a little shadow of a goddess that used to exist in that now. And that's kind of where I lie. I lie in that idea and belief system that Rhiannon, Arianrhod, Ceridwen, perhaps as they exist now, they weren't goddesses in the pre-Christian world, but I definitely think there's something within them that is an echo of something much older. And beyond that, I also see myself as a folk witch. Folk witch is just the title I use in English to help people make sense of what it is that I do. It essentially means that I'm a witch who draws inspiration from folklore, folk custom, and folk belief. Folk belief, of course, being the belief of the common people, of the ordinary people, not of the church, not of the ministry or of the kings and queens, but just the beliefs that the normal, ordinary, common people had. And when I look at certain magical traditions that we have from Wales, do I believe that some of them might have echoes again of paganism within them? Maybe, perhaps. But for the most part, I just like them as they are. They are a part of Welsh culture and heritage now. And so when you open up my book, for example, there are spells and charms in there that have been recorded from, say, the 16th or the 17th century. And of course, in the 16th, 17th century, they're not going to write prayers in honor of like some Celtic pagan deity. They're going to call upon God and Jesus and Mary and the Trinity because that's what was apparent in their culture at the time. But I don't think those spells and charms, just because they call upon the Trinity or the Virgin Mary, are any less valuable and any less magical because of that. So I like to kind of, I call it the crooked path, which is a very different definition to what other witches call the crooked path. But I call it the crooked path because I like to imagine that if you envision that Christianity is over here on the right and paganism is over here on the left, then I kind of wander a path that kind of zigzags between the two. So some kind of central path that sometimes goes over here, sometimes goes over there. So I love things like the culture we have surrounding our saints and the holy wells that are attributed to these saints and the magical beliefs that are embedded in the worship of these saints and such. But I also love to try and think, what would the pre-Christian inhabitants of this nation have done long before Christianity came here? So I'm a product of today, I like to say. I don't like to pretend that I'm a pagan who lives in the past, and I don't like to pretend that I'm a Christian either. I'm something in the middle, and I like to pull inspiration from whatever works, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And one thing, like, well, the major difference between now and the past is the natural world and the wild world and how we emotionally respond to that. And for me, goddesses in the pagan past that we associated with water were, as much as they were something that we could hold faith to, they were reminders of our place in the natural world so that we could appreciate, honor, and understand and respect some very scary things that come from the natural world. Like Wales, the UK was a giant forest, and there are animals in the forest that you probably don't want to go speaking to. So there were stories of, stories that are for children, just, and they're elaborated so that a child's mind can understand it. But to the adults, there was a faith and a reverence to the power that nature has on us. And I think it's hard to place ourselves in the past because we don't have that natural world around us for us to emotionally respond to. And the archetypes that come through us in today's society aren't the same because of the natural world that was around us, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose in many ways, to me, it's important to remember that we are modern people and we do need to look at the world as it exists around us now. So this might be me getting on my high horse now just because it's at the forefront of my mind. But I always find it rather peculiar. And some people might see this as shady, so I do forgive me for being shady on your podcast. But
speak your truth. That's all.
But to me, I find it very strange how many people seem to really try and build this practice that is, in their eyes, purely pre-Christian, devoid of Christianity, devoid of any modernity, and is based solely on what the ancient Celts might have done. But then they don't realize like just how much they're not living to that worldview. So for example, you'll see a lot of these people talk about how much they care for the natural world, how much they really love the natural world. but then they'll go to places that are inherently like sacred and natural. They'll go to special rivers and standing stones and stone circles and burial mounds at times like yesterday, the solstice, and they'll celebrate and they'll say how much they love the natural world and they have a reverence for it. And then they'll leave their beer cans and their tea light candles and their plastic wrappers from the food that they've eaten, and they'll pour offerings of salt onto the floor.
This is not shade speech. This is truth talk right now. There is a lack of integration in the spiritual community, and I am down with getting on board with that statement, because that is, I see it too, and it's, you know, you can't, everyone's on their own journey, you know, and I guess they'll get there, you know.
Yes.
But I totally understand and can relate to the frustration of the lack of integration in people's practices. But maybe that's, you know, without again sounding like high horsey or anything, but maybe that's what a lot of us are here to do, is to just help, you know, with that transition from having the knowledge to integrating it into daily life, you know.
Because with for me, with celebrating the well, not just the solstice, but a celebration of life itself, comes with being like practical and intentional about the feast that I'm having. And if I'm going to have a feast of a group of people around a fire to celebrate the earth, I would like for everyone to be, you know, intentional about, you know, where is that coming from. It would be nice to have more local, you know, produce, so that we can actually say thank you. When we're saying thank you to the food, thank you to the land, you know, I like to be.
You're not just turning up with chips and beer.
Yeah, exactly. But it's hard not to, because of the society that we live in, and no judgment upon that. You know, I've done my celebrations in the woods, and we've had to go to Tesco before because I've got a little baby. You know, but yeah, it is nice to be intentional and aware of the ecology when honouring and thanking it.
It's like you said, it's a balance, isn't it? To find, it's, you know, it's the same as having being pagan here and Christian here. There's a balance. And it's the same, there's polarity and there's nuances. And I totally believe that people can believe two opposing views at the same time, you know, and that cannot be a problem. It doesn't have to be a problem. You know, I don't know how we got onto that from like littering, but here we are.
Like litter picking is an offering that I've it's a new offering for me this year that I've it's fun and it's really nice to do that.
We're almost sad. We have our little litter pickers. I got my little girl coming out for walks with me. Come on, we're gonna clean up the neighborhood. There was one other thing I did want to ask before we just move on from well, not move on, but I know we'd like to talk a little bit about fairies and the fae folk, but if we can just, I do have one question between, like, so I do wonder sometimes, like you mentioned how like they may not have been gods pre-Christian, and they sort of developed into gods, or they became revered as gods because of their special gifts and stuff. Have you ever wondered if maybe at one point they were actually people, like, who had special gifts? Like, I don't know. I'll touch on like the Irish side, because that's just what I happen to know more about. I've looked into it a bit more. With the Tuatha De Danann and the stories about how they faced off with the Fomorians, I think that's, oh no, the Gauls, sorry, and ended up going underground. But during those battles, they describe a lot of things like manipulating the waves of the ocean and the clouds and things like this. And if you look at stories of so the past life sessions from like Edgar Casey talks a lot about how the Atlanteans and the Lemurians, I mean, these are humans essentially before we densified to what we are now, but we were able to do all these, what would today be deemed magical things. So I wonder if like people like Ceridwen, who, you know, created the elixir of pure Awen, And like, is that a gift that maybe we just had once upon a time? And then obviously through thousands and millions of years, it becomes a story then, And I just wonder if there's the potential, like, people like yourself who practice magic, you obviously have an understanding that special things can and do happen,
Mhm.
So I
Okay.
just wonder where you fell on that, how you feel.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion surrounding that idea, the idea that these characters are essentially ancestor characters or ancestral roles, or at the very least that there's some kind of archetypal characters that are almost like the amalgamation of lots of different historical characters, perhaps. One of the best ones that I can think of off the top of my head is King Arthur. King Arthur, of course, there's a lot. It's such a muddy kind of bog pool, however you want to say it, when it comes to Arthur, because there's a lot of ideas about who Arthur is. The oldest literature we have about Arthur is, of course, ours, Welsh. So a lot of Welsh people do very much lay claim over him and they say he's Welsh. The truth is, like, he's not really Welsh. He's more so Brythonic. He's the ancestor of the Welsh. He was one of the peoples who, if he was a real person, he would have been one of the peoples who kind of came before the Welsh even existed as a people, and probably spoke the language of the Brythonic peoples. Or another kind of theory around him is that he was actually a king in the early part of the like 5th, 4th century onwards, around there, and that he was Welsh, and that he was very much Christian, because if you look at a lot of the stories surrounding him, it's that it's one of the reasons I struggle with why King Arthur plays such a big role within pagan traditions, because essentially his primary story is that he is this noble and grand Christian king who is fighting against the savage, brutal pagan Anglo-Saxons. He is this Christian British force who is fighting against these incoming pagan soldiers who are horrible because they're pagan. So to me, it's like it's a bit strange that pagans love him so much, because even in Welsh mythology, he's just this brutal, a bit of a dick, really, who swings his sword around and kills witches and kills anyone magical that he sees. So I've always struggled with him. But he is he's the best case. He, in my eyes, is the best case of, like, in my personal opinion, I think he, if he ever did exist, is probably a kind of amalgamated character of various other people, actual real people, that got squished to create this perfect king image. So perhaps like there were 4 or 5 legendary kings who were really special and really important to the history of this place, and they got squished together and turned into a Brenin Arthur, so this one singular Arthurian character. But the idea of a lot of these mythological characters being real people at some point is still quite a big thing in a lot of circles, and a lot of people do genuinely believe it. I know that my friend Gwilym Morris Baird, he often fights with, not fights, but he disagrees with a lot of neo-pagans who see certain characters from the Mabinogi as gods, as immortal gods, because in his view, he says, and this is the line that always gets me, is he says, some of the characters within Welsh mythology are mortal, and they need to be mortal, because if they're not mortal, if they're immortal gods, their stories lose their value, because their death and their mortality is important to the story, to the very narrative that's being woven. So, for example, Branwen has become a goddess within modern pagan circles, but to me, I always struggle seeing her as a goddess, because the very crux of her story, like the very emotional high point of her story, is her death, is her cease to exist. And there is an argument to be made that just because she's dead doesn't mean she can't exist on some kind of spiritual plane. But to me, it's like the fact that she is gone, she just does not exist anymore, is what makes her story so gut-wrenching and so important to our people. To me personally, there is an essence of my spirit that very much believes that perhaps these characters did exist at some point in some capacity. I think some of that belief I have in the back of my head is a hang up from school, because when I was taught about the Mabinogi in school, they never taught us that these characters were gods, but they also never taught us that these characters were just literary characters either. When my teachers taught me the stories of the Mabinogi or some ancient Welsh stories from like folklore and such, they talked about it as if it was history, as if it happened. So, Bendigeidfran, the giant king, it was very much within my belief, like in primary school and in the first few years of secondary school. It was like, oh yeah, he just existed. He was
Yeah.
just a king that
Well, he
lived in
just walked
Harlech.
across the sea. Yeah, he just
Yeah,
went
he
up
just
there,
did that.
picked up Branwen.
Yeah, well, it's very similar to the Christian stories, isn't it? Where the prophets were, they had gifts and they had morals to teach, and they were higher morals compared to the average folk. The average folk would be inspired by them to live their day-to-day life. And yeah, it really reminds me of that. And we don't call them gods and goddesses, like Noah, for example, but he split the sea. He worked with the waters in a magical way. It feels weird saying that sentence.
But it's
Using
true,
the word
though.
magic.
He did do that. He did part like, well, if he did. But
yeah, and it's
but
the
it's
same
the
question,
same
were they
story
real?
about the Tuatha De Danann. They were able to move the oceans, and so yeah, I think I actually agree. I there's a little part of me that's just like, I reckon we probably did that at some point. So yeah,
Literally.
I think because I don't like the whole the trend about alien gods, like the if there's aliens out there, they whether they're technologically advanced or not, they're our peers. They're not gods, And to say that we're only the humans that we are now because somebody came down and messed with our genetics. Well, I'm sorry. First of all, messing with genetics that already exist is not creation. It's not divine creation. It's you're messing with it. I just don't. I think it takes away from the divinity that we have as a species, the same as any other creature has a divine essence. So I also theorized, I'm sure other people have as well, that potentially when that tribe went underground, they became the Fae or the She. What do you think about those theories?
Um, there's a lot of kind of different theory. I'm specifically like when it comes to fairies, I only really can speak for the ones that we have here in Wales. I'm not very knowledgeable when it comes to the ones over in Ireland. My lovely friend Morgan Daimler is amazing, an amazing resource for that. And thankfully, I've read a lot of their books. So I do have a background, like fringe knowledge of it. But other than that, I've only really looked into the Welsh side of things. And the idea of the fairies being a kind of euhemerized kind of culture that were at one point people and then they went underground is something that you read a lot about in the works of people like Sir John Rhys. So Sir John Rhys is one of the biggest kind of folklorists that we have within Welsh culture. And his ideas echoed into various other collections of folklore for a long, long time. So he very much believed that the fair folk as we know them, at least the Tylwyth Teg, the ones who pretty much look like we do, because that's the biggest thing that I think a lot of people struggle with fairies, is that when we look at the actual mythos that we have here in Wales, a lot of the times they don't look too dissimilar to us. They're often described as being pretty much identical to what we look like. Some of them are beautiful, some of them are ugly, some of them are slightly shorter, so they're sometimes small, but they're never smaller than, say, the size of a child or something. They're never like the size of an insect or anything like that. There's nothing like that within Welsh culture, because I often get, especially over on TikTok, I'll sometimes say, when we talk about the Tylwyth Teg and Welsh Fairies, we're not talking about the Tinkerbell style ones where they're small with insect wings, or the little kind of flower fairies that you see in Mary Cicely Barker's kind of paintings and such. We're not talking about that. The Tylwyth Teg are something a bit different to that. And I often get people messaging me going, well, what would you call that type then? What would you call the little flower fairies and sprites and the ones that look like insect-sized people with wings? And I always have to let them down by saying we don't really have that within our folklore. That's a very, very modern kind of idea that only made its way into folklore really at the turn of the 20th century. So as the 19th century became the 20th century, as we moved from the 1800s into the 1900s, it's only around then that we start seeing those types of fairies coming in. Before that,
until you said, but now I'm thinking back to every like fairy tale, like fairies. You're right. They're not little.
no, they're often like the smallest that they are. So we have one story from the 12th century, which is one of the oldest stories we have recorded in a literary sense from Wales. And it talks about a priest called Elidir. So this priest was, I can't remember where exactly he used to live. I'm pretty sure it was somewhere in South Wales, but he was called Elidir, or in the Latin, because at that point in the 12th century, a lot of Welsh writing was done. Though people spoke in the Welsh language, they still wrote in Latin.
Yeah.
So he's either Elidir, if we're speaking Welsh, or Elidorus, if we're speaking Latin, or if we're writing in Latin. And there's this whole story within Giraldus Cambrensis, Itinerarium Cambrensis, which is the itinerary through Wales. It's basically like, you know, you have those travel vloggers on YouTube nowadays who like go, "Hi guys, I'm going to Thailand for the month. Follow me along on my vlogs." He was basically the 12th century equivalent of that. He went around Wales and he documented everything that he saw. And he met this guy called Elidir. And this guy was a priest and he lived in a monastery. But he had a really interesting backstory in that he spent a lot of time in his youth living with fairies. So he lived with the fair folk. So this proves that not only were fairies very much common knowledge back then, they were something that was very much part of the culture, the lived culture at that time, but they were believed even by Christians. Like Christians believed that fairies definitely existed and they were in the same world as us. And the fairies in that story, they're corporeal. You can touch them. They're not spirits. They're not like wandering around, vanishing into thin air or anything like that. They're very much like us. They're just smaller. They're just slightly shorter than we are. They ride on horses that are around the size of greyhounds, which gives you an equivalent of what size they were. So around the size of children, really. And then they are said to live in this underground chthonic otherworld, which can be accessed via a doorway that can be found at the edge of a river, so in a liminal space. So in this liminal space, Elidir, he had an argument with his parents and ran away, as children like to do. And he heard lots of people looking for him, and he refused to go home. He refused to let anyone find him. And eventually these two fairies came up to him, these two male fairies, and they said, "Why don't you come live with us for a bit?" And he went into this magical, fantastical world. And this place is said to be like very similar to our world, except it's always kind of dusky there. It's always as if it's twilight, as if the sun is setting all the time. So it's slightly dark, slightly misty all the time. Definitely. And it's very much like it's this story that gives us a lot of the motifs that we get in later folklore of what the otherworld and what the fairies are like. So there's a lot of like taboos to him living in the underworld or the otherworld with the fairies. He's told he can't go see anyone from the above world. He can't go see his parents or his family while he's there. Eventually, he manages to convince them to let him go see them. And they say, "Fine, you can go see your mother to tell her where you are after about a year of living there. You can go see your mother now, but do not take anything from our world into that world and give it to your mother." And his mother ends up convincing him to steal something for her because he tells her about how this place, it's amazing, you know, there's jewels everywhere. And even the kids, they play with these balls that are made of pure gold. And that's how rich this kingdom is that he's just been living in. And so his mother says, "Well, I'm struggling for money. Can you grab me one of those balls at least?" And when he does, he's kicked out and he can never go back to living with the fair folk again. So that story in particular, like really showcases how they are very much physical beings that live in kind of an underground version of our world that can be accessed via liminal places. And that they are incredibly rich and incredibly special, and they differ from us only in a few kind of ways. And so people like Sir John Rhys, the folklorist, he took these stories and he decided that in his eyes, the fair folk that are spoken about in older Welsh folklore are actually old Iron Age tribes, or tribes from just after the Iron Age, that people, as the like kind of Christianized culture of Wales started cementing itself, they were still interacting with these pagans essentially that lived in the hills, that lived far away. And over time, the stories of these people became magical, more and more magical as time went on. So there's a lot of ideas like how we know that a lot of Iron Age settlements were built alongside lakes. And then, oh, all these fairy stories about fairies coming out of lakes. There must be a connection. A lot of people within the kind of field of fairy studies are kind of dismissive of this theory nowadays. There's a lot of people who very much think that a lot of these theories were built up by Victorian era academics who were very much trying to make everything as sensible as they could. So, no, of course they're not fairies, they're people, and they just became fairies over time. And a lot of the more academic world, when it comes to study of fairies nowadays, are trying to move away from those theories. But as with all things, things trickle through from academia very, very slowly into normal kind of things. So now a lot of people are starting to learn about that theory of euhemerization, we call it, of the idea that they were people and then they got mythologized and turned into fairies over time. Another theory that I've personally come across that I'm not sure I agree with, but it's definitely the prevailing theory among a lot of pagans nowadays, especially druids, is the idea that the fair folk are an echo of gods that used to exist before. So when we talk about things like the ladies of the lake, those who come out of the lakes and such, it's this idea that at one point in time, those lake maidens were goddesses that people used to go and take offerings to, and they prayed to, and they asked to help them with the harvest and things like that. And then over time, because of Christianization, they got denigrated down to fairy status. So they're not gods anymore, they're just fairies. They're just these strange spirits that live. Because, in a Christian society, you can't have God and other goddesses. It's a very monotheistic faith. So to make sense of that, it's like they're not gods, they're fairies. And fairies within a Christian context are essentially demons because they're not angels. So they must be demons. And so they saw them as very kind of horrible things that you stay away from. And we see that within the language of a lot of Welsh texts, because a lot of the words used to describe fairies are also used to describe devils and demons. So like, for example, ellich. Ellich is a word that we come across a lot in the Welsh language to describe these elf-like nature-based spirits. So they're these small mischievous things that live out in the landscape, and they're not fully comprehensible to us. We don't fully get them. Sometimes they have a physical form, sometimes they don't. But the big thing about them is that they have a deep connection with the natural world and with the landscape around us. And the ellich, the name for them has been used also to describe demons. So I often get in trouble with a lot of Welsh people when I'm speaking in the Welsh language. For example, I did a documentary with Caris Eleri over on the Welsh TV channel S4C. And during a ritual that I created for the TV station to air, because I always... Sorry?
I think I watched that.
Yeah, it was great. I loved it. But it was great taking part. And I always, when I go on TV or something like that, I craft rituals that I don't mind the camera seeing. And during that ritual, I said the phrase cyfarchafu ellich y lle hon, which translates to I call to the ellich of this place. And there was this one particular Welsh speaker, who lost his shit over me saying that. He was like, you can't call to the ellich. The ellich are demons and they'll rip you shred to shred. Like horrible, horrible little things. Like they're nasty. And it just shows how the terms have become so mingled.
I probably would have panicked too. In my head, ellich means demon.
Oh,
But
there we
I
go.
think that's just something I learned as a child. Like
Mhm.
and obviously because my parents don't speak Welsh, like it's not like I had family around to teach me about different words for different things. Whatever I learned in school, that's what it was, you know?
Yeah, it's
So,
really
yeah, I
interesting
probably would have
because
freaked out.
I didn't learn about any of this in school, but what the first book I bought about Fae in Wales was British Goblins, which
Mhm.
is where Sir John Rees is sharing all of the stories that
I
he's
really need
heard
to
from
get this
people.
book.
It's a brilliant book. So that was my introduction to it. And as a Welsh person that doesn't speak Welsh, like I'm quite glad that I don't have that association with it.
Mm.
But what is really interesting with like my belief is more on your first line of thought where they were theorizing they were real beings that are more more connected. This is what I believe. They're more connected to the natural world, and they aren't as they're not the same as us as humans. Like, so different insects perceive time in a very different way. Different animals perceive time in a different way. And I think it's more along the lines of that, which is why it's incomprehensible. Because if they have a state of consciousness that's very similar to us, where we're able to have conversations, but they live in a very different reality, and it is the earth spirit expressing itself in a different way. And with the rise of Christianity, they didn't like that. So, these beings did have powers and gifts and ways of working with reality and nature that Christianity didn't like, because Christianity wanted to have their power and their expression of what the divine is and what non-human magic is really. But Victoria showed me a documentary on YouTube called Hellier, and over in Kentucky.
I knew you'd have seen that.
Okay. Yeah.
We could do a whole show just on that.
I'm glad that you just nodded your head, because these stories aren't just ancient stories. Perhaps here in Wales, people aren't experiencing these goblins, these goblini, these beings.
I've seen stuff.
I've seen stuff. Actually, good segue onto any experiences that you've had that you can't explain.
Yeah, let's all share one. That'd be a nice one.
So for me, I've had one experience. I was 13 and I was in St. David's on the West Coast at a little hippie festival, and I saw on the field opposite the field that I was on about six orbs of different colours moving up and down. They were quite far away and they were big, colourful orbs moving up and down in a really weird way. And I was like, are they kids with like poi sticks? Are they people doing a performance or something? And I just never thought about it. I just, didn't cross my mind. I wasn't spiritual at all. And then I started getting into spirituality and fae and spirits and whatnot. And I was like, wait, I saw something when I was 13 and I have no idea what it was. I wouldn't know I don't know. I don't call it anything. I don't place names on it, but it definitely, it was there. What I saw was there. And are there any experiences like that happen up there? Do you know anyone that's seen any colourful orbs floating around natural spaces?
Oh, definitely. There's a whole kind of bit of lore surrounding strange orbs, different kinds of ones as well. So, like for example, I talk a little bit in my book about the Echechdan. The Echechdan. It translates to mean the fire of the elves or the fire of the fairies. And it's this belief that the fairies could construct, or sometimes in some types of stories surrounding these, that they are their own conscious beings in their own right, is that they are these orbs of light that kind of take people on a bit of a journey and cause them to become very lost. There are other stories as well of these ones like dragging them to bogs and marshlands, making them wander off the paths to danger, essentially. Getting hypnotized almost by them. And then there's also a lot of stories surrounding strange lights in woodlands, not so much orbs, but strange lights in the distance. And these strange lights have been associated specifically in Wales with both fairies and witches. So the idea that if you were wandering at night and you saw strange lights in the distance, that it was a sign that either the fair folk were dancing over there, and they were having their little revelries and you should stay away, or witches were doing crap over there and you should also stay away. So it was it's often like either that these things are leading you to something that you need to see, or they're leading you to danger, or that you should just stay away from them altogether. So it's really hard, I think, when we look at the lore and the beliefs surrounding them. Which one do you go for? Like, do you believe? Yeah,
Yeah, I didn't
absolutely.
feel drawn to it at all. I didn't feel any sense of anything wanted me to go towards it. It was more of a hello, oh, she's seen us, we're carrying on. That's the vibe I got. So yeah, but it was right next to the coast, and if I did follow them and then they went off of the cliff from the coast, I would have ended up in the sea. So I'm glad that they didn't call to me.
Definitely.
What about you? You go next.
The one thing I want to pick up on really before, because it kind of makes sense of the story I'm about to tell, is you said about these beings perhaps experiencing time differently. And that is a huge aspect of Welsh fairy folklore, is this idea of time moving differently. So we see it a lot with things like the fairy islands that are out to sea. Sometimes people will go on to these islands, come off of it, and realize it's not been 10 minutes, it's been 80 years. We have it in the Mabinogi, Bendigeidfran, and the kind of the people that gathered with him on Ynys Gwales, which is down in the south of Wales as well. They didn't experience time, they didn't age, and they didn't experience the passage of time whilst on this island.
Is that the story in the Great Hall with the giant head?
Yes, so they were
slayed me as a kid. I was like, what?
But yeah, that story to me is similar to the stories that we have of fairy islands as well, where it's like it's the same idea of these islands where time moved differently. And it's often like the first hint in a lot of Welsh fairy stories that you are experiencing something of the otherworld is that time moves differently, that you start like feeling like either you feel like time is going really quickly, or you feel like time's going really slowly, or even that you just don't notice time at all. Like it's almost like
so that really reminds me, and we won't like fully go into this, but I've got a video that I shared on TikTok and Instagram, I'm not sure you saw, where I'm bringing my psychedelic plant experiences, my mushroom experiences, and comparing them to the mythology and stories, and the, like as you said, like people walk into mushroom rings and they end up in an other world where time is not quite what it was, and they come back sometimes insane. I have witnessed goblin-like creatures and pixies while communing with the psychedelic mushrooms, and that's like a whole other tangent. But I think there's definitely something there for me that I have spoken to Gwilym about actually, where yeah, there's something there for sure. But yeah, I just wanted to pop that in there, not to carry on with it because we could have a whole conversation about that.
Definitely. There's a lot in that, I think. And it's like, it's very apparent that this idea of time moving differently is important within Welsh culture, especially within like the bardic tradition that we have here, because the word in the Welsh language for entertain is difyrru, to difyrru. And difyrru, when we break it down etymologically, like looking at the different words, it's di, vir, I. And vir means short and d means to un. So when we look at like what the word for entertain essentially means, it's to manipulate time. To entertain someone is to manipulate time. It's to unshorten time. So even in the bardic tradition, where entertaining by like poetry or by acting or by doing something that was entertaining on stage, they understood that the way you could tell if somebody was a good bard or not was if they took you to the other world, so to speak, they lengthened or shortened the time around you. They made it, and we've all been there, we've all watched a film or watched a play or a theatre performance or listened to a song and gone, wait, it's been 10 minutes? How? Like it feels like
Einstein, the Druids knew it first.
Yeah. Definitely. And like to me, that's always my first sign whenever I experience anything that I believe might be of the other. It's always the first thing I do is try and think, what's my experience with time right now? Like, do I feel like time is moving at all? Do I feel like time's going quickly? what's going on. And the most kind of intense experience I've ever had, which I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone about before, is an experience I had when I was around 19. I just started university and I was back home for the summer. And there is still there, hopefully, there is a nature reserve on Caergybi, Holy Island, Holyhead, and it's called Penrhos Nature Reserve, and it's currently under threat, so sadly. But it's this glorious nature reserve that I used to love going to for walks with my friends and such, and it's absolutely stunning there. One of my favourite places in all of Anglesey. And I was walking through there on my own. I was completely alone, and I was meeting friends there. Friends were meant to come and meet me there. And eventually, after walking around, and I remember feeling this sense of like, when you just feel like something's not right for a long time. After about 10 minutes of that, my friends finally met up with me. And I said to them, something's weird today. I'm feeling strange, like this strange sensation. But off we went. We went to have our little picnic in the nature reserve. And there's these various paths along the nature reserve where you can split off from people and then meet up with them again later on. The paths diverge and then they re-verge together. And at one point, I diverged from the group of people I was with, and I went into this part that we used to call the secret garden because it's this walled section. And there's this glorious archway, this stone archway to kind of symbolize the start or the end of it, depending which way you go in. I went in through like a little crack in the wall, and then I ended up near this arch. And as I was approaching the arch, I could hear my friends in the distance still talking to each other. And it's almost like their voices faded out of existence. They just weren't there anymore. And I was looking at this arch and walking towards it, and it wasn't getting any closer. And I remember thinking, what is going on? The panic started hitting me then. The adrenaline started going through my body. And I was trying to walk towards this archway, and I couldn't get any closer to it. So then I started having a bit of a panic attack. And then I was like, what is going on? What's happening? And I turned around and I decided, let's walk the other way then instead. Let's see what happens. And when I turned around, there was a woman just stood there. This old woman, nothing special. She wasn't like some goddess dressed in like flowing robes. She was a like middle-aged woman, bit older maybe, that was dressed in one of those yellow raincoat type things and wellies that look like they've been bought from Tesco because they had daisy prints all over them. And she had a little hat, a woolly hat on. I remember that very vividly. And she was just smiling at me. She was just looking at me, smiling. And I just thought, I'll just walk this way because it's just the normal woman, isn't it? And I walked towards her and I said, Bore da, good morning to her. And she stopped me. She grabbed my arm. She looked at me and she didn't say anything for a long time. She just nodded.
Whoa.
And smiled. And then she went, sorry, it was in Welsh, so I'll have to do it in Welsh and then repeat in English. She went, ti bach ar goll dwyt. And I went, she was like, so you're a bit lost, aren't you? And I was like, yeah. And then she was like, oh, ti'n dod yma lot? And that's just like, do you come here a lot? And I was like, I do. And she went, dim diweddar, which means like, not lately. You haven't been here much lately, have you? And I went, and I don't know why, it just came out to me. I just went, no, I've been at university, like I've been away, I've been learning. And she went, good, keep learning. She said something along the lines like that. And then she went into her little pocket and she pulled out a little yellow flower that looked like it had just been freshly picked. And she gave me the flower. And she went, dos hwnna efo chdi, a dos yn ôl ffordd na, which is just take that with you and you can go back that way. And so she was pointing towards the archway that I'd turned away from. So I took the flower and I turned back towards the archway. And then I went and I found my friends. They were through the little arch. They were in a little benched area. There's this like little bench that has a sundial on top of it. And I went and met my friends there. And my friends turned to me and they went, where the fudge have you been? And I was like, oh, I've just been chatting to an old lady, not been gone long. And they went, it's been like 40 minutes since we last saw you. We were about to get worried because we couldn't find you anywhere. And they said that they'd walked through the arch into that secret garden bit. And to me, I was stood right there on the path along next to the arch, not only a few meters away from the arch. They said they'd walked that way and I wasn't there. So they couldn't find me there in that moment. And it was that moment that everything inside me just went whoop, made their way towards my genitals, and I was like, oh, what just happened? And I felt like I wanted to throw up. And to me, as mundane as that experience sounds, it
That's
is
not
one of the
mundane.
most
That's not
intense.
mundane. That is so not mundane. Can I just, I mean, you've obviously probably thought about this a lot, but as soon as you said that you were walking towards the archway and it wasn't getting any closer, it literally reminds me of Rhiannon on the horse and Pwyll chasing her, but he never gets any closer until he speaks to her. And you turned around and you spoke to that woman and she gave you something so that you could get closer to. Do you ever think that was Rhiannon?
I've never really made sense of that situation. I've sat here and I've pondered over it for so many years, and I still can't. I've been back to the same location. Never anything like that has ever happened again. I've had spiritual experiences there, but nothing like that like made every hair on my body stand up straight. But every time I talk about it, even now, I'm looking down, I've got goosebumps because I can't talk about it.
I was feeling a very strong sense of deja vu, and as you said, the yellow flower, I felt like this is really weird, but I felt like I knew what you were going to say, like it's like, or that I'd heard this story before. What's
really funny is when we were sat out the back earlier, and I was looking for a flower to put that bee on.
The yellow lilies.
I was looking at the yellow flowers.
Yeah.
I know it's probably nothing, but it's just all these. I love synchronicities like this. Yeah. Wow, that is intense. I enjoyed that. I mean, that was a good one. I have something similar. I don't know if it involves an
what's your
entity.
Story?
Well, it's just this. All right, if I can, in a nutshell, because I don't want to take up loads of time, but I make wedding shoes as part of my day job, and I was making these white shoes and I was painting them, and then I put them on the shelf and I let them cure overnight, and then I come back and I do whatever else I'm doing. And 2 nights in a row, I would put the shoe on the shelf, nice and finished, go back to it the next morning, and there's a really small handprint, like a grey handprint, much smaller than mine, so about like the size of my palm. So not a tiny handprint, like a child's handprint. And for years I didn't think, what it could be. And then somebody talked to me about the Coblynau, and I was like,
or the Bubachod.
Or the Bubachod, the ones who like to play tricks. But the other one that is like more substantial because there was other people there who saw what I saw. And so because I would have questioned my own sanity otherwise. But something just came into being, and it I couldn't see any detail. It was like a black shape, but it was quite tangible, and it sort of floated halfway across the room, and then it's like it took full solid shape and stepped towards me and bent over because it was about 8 foot tall and put his face in my face. And as it did that, my friend next to me grabbed my arm and screamed, and the guy next to her legged it back through the door we came in through. So these experiences are they literally change your life. It's so nice to be able to share stories like this with people who have experienced something similar, and you just know that it's you're like, yeah, that was some messed up shit. What the hell just happened?
Yeah, I didn't have that. My experience was when I was 13, and as a child, I just didn't even question it because I was in that liminal space. I wasn't wowed. I was like, oh, cool, and carried on. I didn't even tell the people that I went over to see afterwards because that childlike connection to that anyway, being in that liminal teenage space.
I can't go. Sorry, I'm still getting really strong Rhiannon vibes. I know Rhiannon technically, maybe wasn't a god or goddess, but I don't know. She had some funky time dilation powers, I reckon, and I just really got that vibe. I can't. Yeah. I'm so glad you shared that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you the first time you've shared it.
Honored.
Yay! Oh, nice. Yeah.
Humbled.
Well, yeah, we've not got long on the recording now. I think that's a great way to end the podcast. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. It's been such a nice chat.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It has been absolutely lovely chatting to you as well.
I hope you've had a nice time. Maybe we can chat again sometimes. There's just so much like to talk about, and I'm waiting for that second book. I know you started writing it.
Yes. Oh my gosh, don't remind me. I've got it. I need to send it into my publisher in a couple months.
Not long
So,
now, not long.
no, not long at all.
Okay, so anyone waiting?
Yeah, and anyone who wants to look into more of what Mara's talking about, if you're not a book person, she's got a whole YouTube channel. She's all over TikTok and Instagram. And
if you're too busy like me to actually sit down sometimes and read a book, it is on Audible. So yeah, I've enjoyed it. She's very nice. She's really learned how to pronounce the Welsh words. The Lorna who's reading it.
Yes, Lorna Smithers, I think her name is.
Yeah. Yes, it's been a nice listen. So yeah.
Oh,
anyways, yeah. So thank you.
All right. See ya.
Oh, thank you. Bye.